Hello YouTube. This video has materials that are not so easy to talk about because they have to do, most of them, with the Vietnam War, and this was a battlefield of superpowers. So I feel that some of the information is still sensitive, so to say, and I don't use anything but open sources. But in my belief is that we don't know probably 30% of the whole story of what took place in Vietnam. And of course, UFOs are in the mix as well. But it's not only about UFOs. So it's a very interesting subject, and I'll tell you what I know, my research. And let's understand that in Vietnam, like in other countries, there are periodic reports from people who allegedly observed UFOs. Most of them are then convincingly explained by natural causes and human activity, but not all. For many centuries in Vietnam, people have recorded rare appearances of unusual moving objects in the sky. These were not the usual everyday sun, moon, and stars. Judging by the descriptions of eyewitnesses, they could have been comets and meteorites. Well, there was an interesting case similar to the appearance of a UFO that took place during the French colonial period on October 23, 1887, in the village of Thanh Duc, Tay Ninh province. And you have to understand, Ukrainian pronunciation of Vietnamese words may not be the most correct one, but you have what you have. In the evening, many people were sitting in front of their houses. They saw how suddenly a large, bright, cigar-shaped object with a long flame flew in from the west and landed on a field near the village. A moment later, the sound of an explosion, like a bang, was heard, and the object flew into the sky. This incident caused a stir. The locals thought it was a fire dragon from heaven. They didn't know if it was good or evil, but they built a structure for worship. The rumors reached the French colonial authorities, and they sent an artillery officer whose last name was Delanoux to investigate. He arrived at the site on November 3rd and visited the field where the unidentified object landed. And there he found a depression in the ground 6 meters wide, 32 meters long, and 2 meters deep. Delanoux made a report to his superior about what he had heard and observed. This incident became widely known in this area, and for a long time elderly people told their children the story of the descending fire dragon, which they in turn heard from their fathers. Unfortunately, the Delanoux report is stored in the archives of the French Ministry of Defense, but also it could have been lost. It's hard to judge, what it was that they had observed without that report. Now, if you believe the stories of local residents, then the most likely hypothesis would be a landing, including an emergency and the takeoff of a thermal balloon. The French have been using balloons, or probably like dirigibles too, in Indochina since 1884. They even sent a detachment of military balloonists there. By that time, there were already controlled cigar-shaped balloons, the length of which reached 52 meters. Look, as always in such cases, it's also possible to allow that a brief UFO landing with or without aliens took place. Most of the stories about UFO encounters in Vietnam relate to the period of the so-called Vietnam War. After it ended, many American veterans claimed that aliens interfered in military operations. I just want to give you a few examples, because Western ufology I've not been writing about since early 1990s. I did in Russian, and my articles were smuggled into the Soviet Union and reprinted and so forth, where I introduced local population to ufology in, for example, in cases in the United States, Australia, and so forth. So here that's why I don't collect Western stories and observations, but I have a few. In June of 1966, at the American military base in Nha Trang, at about 21:45, the sky to the north suddenly began shining. At first, people thought it was a security check flare that was there every night, but an object was flying from the north, initially at an altitude of about 7 kilometers, according to the estimates of jet pilots at the base. Then it dropped very quickly and hovered at 150 meters. At the same time, all active generators, communication systems, aircraft and vehicles of the base suddenly shut down. After a few minutes, it suddenly took off into the sky at a very high speed. The equipment of the base was working again. After receiving reports of this strange event, the U.S. Department of Defense sent a number of officials to Vietnam to investigate, but did not publish the results or comments on that incident. And this is the Russian information, by the way, I'm reading to you, which was published in Russia. So you have to understand the source and make your own judgments. Now, it was assumed that could be assumed that it was a ball lightning. Now, if we assume that it was an aircraft of unknown technology, then a power outage at the base speaks in favor of this. In many cases, when suspected UFOs appear, power outages occur. Ufologists suggest that UFOs are fueled with energy in a contactless way from ground-based energy facilities. In 1968, 2 patrol boats on the military line between North and South Vietnam found several glowing round objects near them. 2 saucers hovered over the first patrol boat. The members of the second patrol ship saw a strange light coming from the saucers aimed at the first patrol boat. The Americans from their various ships in the area began to fire at flying objects, but hit the first boat and sank it. Similar objects were seen in 1969 in Pleiku in the Central Highlands, and in both cases everything happened in the dark. On June 17, 1968, an incident occurred with the Australian destroyer Hobart. In the early morning, an approaching aerial object was detected from it. It fired at the Hobart and in turn was shelled, but no wreckage of the object was found. In addition, there were stories about UFOs allegedly flying in the demilitarized zone between North and South Vietnam. The DMZ was a strip several kilometers wide that separated the two states according to international agreements, but most likely helicopters, searchlights, or reconnaissance drones were mistaken for UFOs. Drones were especially actively used in the DMZ area, and it is no coincidence that it was there that most UFOs were recorded. Often drones were equipped with strobe lights that activated over a selected target area to illuminate it. This had a psychological effect on the North Vietnamese and caused them great surprise. Ordinary Americans were also not aware of drones. The program, according to the Russians, was top secret and probably mistook them for UFOs. In one of the comments to the subject that I read in the Russian media, I found this one. It was put there by Galina on April 27, 2015. In the distant 1970s, her husband and she lived in a northern village in the Soviet Union, where the school director or principal was a Vietnam War veteran, from the Soviet side, of course. Galina's husband became friends with him then, and one day in a conversation that man told a strange story about how some flying object hit an American artillery installation. It was forbidden to talk about UFOs at that time in the Soviet Union, and it was impossible to explain this incident with anything else. The installation literally melted. Very interesting. Now, let's look at the Soviet information regarding the Vietnam War and strange objects that attacked the Soviets in the Vietnam War. It is a very complicated story, as you can imagine. Again, it involves superpowers and their special services, And as far as we know, I mean, most of this information is classified. But let's see what the remaining information, what something that has been declassified can tell us. Again, this is all based on open sources and diligent research. So, what were the Soviets doing in the war-torn Vietnam? To help the local communists initially, money and resources came from Red China. But Vietnam's complicated history with China's attempts to establish dominance over the country eventually forced them to turn to the Soviet Union for help. This help came in several forms. The USSR sent money, weapons, and military advisors to Vietnam. The advisors often took on a much active role. Numbers vary from 6,000 to 3,000 Soviet military personnel who had served in North Vietnam during the war. Although they were designated as Soviet military experts, which allowed the USSR to claim that the Soviet soldiers did not participate in the war. Of this 6,000 to 3,000 people, reportedly by some Russian sources, 16 died during the conflict. We'll talk more about the alleged Soviet losses there. By comparison, more than 2.7 million Americans had served during the Vietnam War, and more than 58,000 American soldiers died. Compared to this, the participation of the Soviet Union was clearly insignificant. But it really did take place. Although it was a small number, the Soviet participation in the war was very significant. Since 1964, North Vietnamese fighter pilots and anti-aircraft gunners had been trained in the Soviet Union. Soviet advisors were also present in North Vietnam. At first, when the North Vietnamese troops were not yet familiar with the new Soviet anti-aircraft batteries, Soviet crews operated those guns themselves. And these crews actually shot down American airplanes, according to Russian sources. It is reported that one such Soviet battery shot down 6 American aircraft. Soviet archives opened after the collapse of the USSR demonstrate that these anti-aircraft units had served most of the war. For the North Vietnamese, it was an invaluable help. And for the Soviet Union, this made it possible to test new equipment. And so the soldiers were tested too, in the real conditions. Soviet participation was not limited to anti-aircraft calculations, so to say. There were also widespread reports that Soviet snipers had infiltrated North Vietnamese armed force units and also infiltrated South Vietnam to test the new Dragunov SVD sniper rifles. Witnesses described these snipers as white people with blue eyes. Outside of South Vietnam, but still in the unofficial theater of operations, Soviet GRU special forces took part. We're speaking about the Foreign Military Intelligence Agency of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the USSR. The existence of the GRU, or Main Intelligence Directorate, was not publicized during the Soviet era. Maybe they participated in more ground combat operations and in other operations. You know, allegedly in 1968, a group of 10 commandos attacked a secret US base on the Cambodian-Vietnamese border, actually in Cambodia, destroying 3 new, at that time, US attack helicopters Cobra and actually hijacking another one. This operation was confirmed only after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Well, there are a lot of rumors about it, and I don't know what confirmation means, because there are different groups saying different things. Anyway, and if there was one mission of the Soviet Special Forces, then almost certainly there could have been more. And this is something that I believe. Like special services missions, this information rarely comes to light. In addition to actual combat operations, the role of supply and support that the USSR played in the war was also greatly underestimated. Ho Chi Minh's famous saying is, "You can kill 10 of us against your one and we will still win." The Russians today say this, but without Soviet help, the so-called unshakable will would not have been able at all to resist the Americans, not to mention winning. Since 1968, the Soviet Union has provided the vast majority of the military and economic assistance that the North Vietnam received. They supplied their communist allies with food, oil, vehicles, iron, steel, fertilizers, weapons, and ammunition. Most importantly, the Soviets provided all this aid, not loans. Unlike how the Chinese did it at the beginning of the war, according to the Russians. This reduced the economic burden on North Vietnam and contributed to the further strengthening of their military efforts. Like many conflicts during the Cold War, Vietnam was partly a war on behalf of between the West and the Soviet bloc. The Soviet Union helped the North Vietnamese communists to win, and this help was undoubtedly crucial. But imagine how many difficulties there were along the way. The remoteness of the Soviet material supply bases from the destinations required building a clear, coordinated system of assistance by types of weapons, logistical and medical support, delivery dates. It is impossible to do this without a reliable, uninterrupted channel of secret special radio communications. As during the Korean War, the task of creating such a channel was assigned to the GRU. For the first time, a radio communication line between the Soviet mission in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or DRV, and Moscow was established in 1954, after the arrival of the ambassador of the Soviet Union in Hanoi. The station was deployed by the scout radio operator Anatoly Morozov. This intense work of Soviet intelligence radio operators began already in 1961, when the United States established headquarters in Saigon, which was soon reorganized into the American Military Command. All these long years of the war, there was a direct radio communication between Hanoi and Moscow. That's important to know, and you will see as we proceed. Now let's look closer at the GRU operations. According to the data given in the book of the Vietnam War veteran Nikolai Kolesnik, titled The Vietnam War as It Was, 1965 to 1973, a group of experts supervised by the main intelligence directorate of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the USSR, whose task was to study American military trophies, they worked in Vietnam since the fall of 1965. According to other information, since May of the same year. That's important. The year is important. The months are important. When military trophies is worth what they were able to get, to snatch, to capture from the Americans. The results of the work of the so-called trophy workers were of great interest to the Ministry of Defense of the USSR and to the Soviet defense industry. According to the memoirs of Anatoly Zaitsev, a veteran of the diplomatic service, published in the Red Star newspaper, this special unit of several reserve officers, headed by a GRU officer, was nicknamed Trophy Hunters by Soviet diplomats. The task of these trophy hunters, in addition to studying and sending samples of American equipment and weapons to the Soviet Union, also included analyzing the conduct of American combat operations in Vietnam and advising the Vietnamese People's Army in terms of developing ways to counter enemy units. Judging by the certificate of the Embassy of the USSR in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, dated March 1967, and addressed to the top leadership of the Soviet Union, the normal work of the special unit of the trophy hunters was often hindered by the Vietnamese side. The diplomat Viktor Zvezdin wrote that at that time, Soviet specialists or experts had been working in Vietnam for almost 2 years. since May 1965, and their activities were coordinated at the level of the Ministers of Defense of the USSR and the DRV. During this period, the trophy hunters selected and sent to the Soviet Union more than 700 samples of American military equipment and weapons. The GRU Special Unit examined downed U.S. Army aircraft, missiles, electronic, photo reconnaissance, and other weapons. In addition, according to the results of this work, several dozen information and analytical reports were compiled, in which American technical documentation was also studied. Most of the research was conducted at the crash sites of the downed aircraft. Viktor Zvezdin wrote that the Vietnamese often hid these points from the Soviet special group or delayed sending cars with trophy hunters to the object of study. In this regard, the trophy hunters had to track the places where American planes fell. They had to do it themselves. They had to find those areas. It happened that the Vietnamese simply did not allow Soviet specialists to examine samples of equipment and weapons. They were dragging their feet and sending them to the USSR when they fell to. It could take up to 3 months. Many cases were also connected with the fact that before arriving at the crash site of the American aircraft, its remains were already being sorted out by Chinese military experts. According to Zvezdin, in January 1968, the Chinese were ahead of the Soviet Special Group, the first to dismantle an enemy upgraded reconnaissance aircraft. Everything valuable was removed from it, and the wreckage was prepared for explosion. The Vietnamese, in order to somehow smooth out the unpleasant situation, handed over to the trophy hunters the American Shrike missile, AGM-45 Shrike. The special group, which included Senior Lieutenant Engineer Alexander Anosov, worked in Vietnam from May of 1965 to December of 1968, often under bombing, shelling, and in the mined territory. As a result, Soviet specialists during the time selected and sent to the USSR more than 800 samples of American equipment and weapons. How many special groups were in Vietnam, and what was the effectiveness of their work? According to the calculations of the chairman of the Presidium of the Interregional Public Organization of Veterans of the Vietnam War, Nikolai Kolesnik, military scientific groups sent from the USSR to Vietnam through the GRU operated in the DRV until 1971 and were headed during this time by 7 career officers of the main intelligence directorate, all were colonels. Kolesnik calls the total number of trophy hunters, and he says there were civilian defense specialists and mostly retired officers. So for the entire time of the Vietnam campaign, up to 50 people, 5 people in a group. Today, less a dozen are alive. They were not counted among the participants of the hostilities at the time. Documented, convincing data on how the trophies obtained by the military scientific special groups of the GRU during the Vietnam War and transported to the USSR influenced the modernization of equipment and weapons of the armed forces of the Soviet Union. But this data still has not yet been made public. There is a publication, Kommersant Vlast, in Russia, analyzing this topic, tends to conclude that the domestic military-industrial complex in the 1960s-1970s, during the Vietnam campaign, became the owner of almost all the novelties of American technology and subsequently engaged in their reproduction. Reverse engineering, I guess. So we have established that the GRU was active in Vietnam during the war, and we'll come back to this. Now, what do we know about UFOs attacking Soviet troops in Vietnam? Perhaps the most intriguing sensations come when we talk about aliens from other planets, so to say, opening fire on Earthlings. There are stories like that, and you can see in my videos Soviet engagements in the USSR, and several very painful cases. But let's look at Vietnam. Let's look at the data available. In 1965, a UFO responded to an attack from the ground, from Earth, for the first time. It happened during the Vietnam War, where Soviet military specialists trained the North Vietnamese army to fire S-75 anti-aircraft missile systems. The S-75 batteries protected the skies over Vietnam's capital, Hanoi, and were mostly located 35 to 40 kilometers from the city. The capital of North Vietnam was defended from air attacks by American aviation by the Air Defense Corps. 9 anti-aircraft missile brigades equipped with the Cube missile system. In that unit, and those units, from the top, from the commander down to the soldiers, all were Soviet servicemen. Anti-aircraft gunners often had to change their location because American pilots quickly spotted them, immediately sent data to the American headquarters, and after the reconnaissance flights, bombers flew out from the American airfields, and they staged a total bombing of Vietnamese positions. One of the Soviet military experts said that one day a huge dark disk with a diameter of about 300 meters appeared over a newly relocated Vietnamese air defense battery. It was hovering at the height of, or the altitude of, only 1.5 kilometers, and of course the battery commander ordered to open fire on the UFO. At least 10 surface-to-air missiles were fired at the UFO, but they did not cause any harm to the object and exploded an approach to it. In response to the aggression, the UFO emitted a thin beam of light that hit the batteries exactly and disabled all the all the weapons. Here's another report from the Russian publications. On July evening, a huge disc-shaped ship hovered over the position of one of the units. Its diameter was more than 300 meters, and at least that's what the missile scientists determined. The flying saucer appeared suddenly, completely silently. Now, this one says, at the altitude of about 10 kilometers. A request was immediately sent using the friend-foe identification system. However, the object did not react to it. The brigade commander immediately contacted the Corps command post and reported on an unusual aerial target. The Americans did not have such compact aircraft. From there, a few minutes later, apparently after a short meeting that the officers held among themselves, an order was received: open fire to kill it. Of the 5 divisions of the brigade in the zone of which the space alien appeared, 3 opened fire, firing 10 missiles. However, to the great annoyance and amazement of Soviet military specialists, all missiles exploded at far distance from the target. The Soviet missile operators were alarmed. Meanwhile, the silver disc directed a needle-thin blue beam at one of the firing divisions, and the entire division, 3 launchers, tracking radars, missile guidance stations, was turned into a pile of melted metal. Remember what Galina said about the Americans. Almost the entire personnel were killed, about 200 people. Naturally, no more missiles were fired at the formidable stranger, and it silently and quickly appeared and disappeared into space. One way or another, the story describes the battle of Soviet missile operators with UFOs near Hanoi. This story is considered the most reliable of the many described duels of missile operators and military pilots with unidentified flying objects. Those are not my words, but I have to tell you what was published. How plausible is this story? Well, modern Russian debunkers are looking to reject it. And it is very curious to me why they would worry so much about the events that took place, 60 years ago? According to them, the story was generated in the early 1990s, and it was initially, they say, it was served at first in a slightly different arrangement. Then it was thought that the fact was quite real. Soviet missile battery operators fired, even if not at a space alien, but at some kind of terrestrial flying saucer. After all, there was the war in Vietnam, and the technical achievements of the United States in the aerospace field are well known. But to take on faith the fact of the battle with UFOs, the death of 200 of their compatriots, as they say, was too much to them. The primary source of the Hanoi story, it turned out to be the New York newspaper, Новое русское слово. It's a Russian immigrant newspaper. It provided its pages to a former Soviet officer who had immigrated to the United States, Mark Steinberg, who had access to secret air defense documents for a long time, according to him. Mark Steinberg notes that what happened near Hanoi is described in detail in the 3-volume work of the former Chief of the General Staff of the Soviet Armed Forces, Marshal Matvei Zakharov, The War in Southeast Asia. He said that the book, equipped with a high security stamp, meaning top secret, covers in detail all aspects of the fighting in Vietnam. In the same place, according to Steinberg, there is also a mention of a special directive to the commander-in-chief of the country's air defense forces, issued after the Hanoi emergency, categorically prohibiting the conduct of hostilities against unidentified spacecraft or aircraft. Modern Russian debunkers have attacked revelations of Mark Steinberg and besmirched him, but Mark Steinberg cannot respond. And from what I know about him, because he had done other investigations, and I had communicated with him many years ago about other cases, not this one. He was a very knowledgeable and professional Soviet military officer who had served in Afghanistan and other countries too. And I personally value his knowledge a lot. But what this demonstrates to me is that the debunkers do not want his information to be accepted as credible. They present statements of the former Soviet commanders who had served in Vietnam to deny Steinberg's information. Perhaps Mark Steinberg, stated the debunkers, is close to the truth only in the part of the story he published where he mentions a special directive of the commander-in-chief of the country's air defense forces allegedly categorically prohibiting the conduct of hostilities against unidentified spaceships. I think this is not the correct translation. I would say unidentified aircraft. Anyway, however, no special directive was issued, but all the directive documents of the Soviet Air Defense Forces unequivocally forbid, and here Steinberg is right, to open fire on a target if it is not identified. The debunkers also denied that many Soviet military personnel could have perished in Vietnam. So let's look at some other sources. In 1975, the last stage of the Vietnam War ended. Official data on the losses of Soviet servicemen in Vietnam during that war period should not be trusted. They amount, according to various sources, from 7 to 16 human beings. According to the testimony of the State Security Colonel Morozov, in addition to the dead, there were several dozen wounded, as well as those who developed concussion neurosis and concomitant mental disorder on the basis of regular aerial bombardments from the Americans. The data that 44 Soviet servicemen died in Vietnam only in the post-war period, 1975 to 2002, are also perceived strangely and not very much believed. A little over 6,000 ordinary, so to say, Soviet officers and about 6,000 privates arrived in Vietnam. So now we have completely different numbers. I think somebody screwed up and should have said 6,000 altogether, officers and privates. But this is Russian information. In addition to military specialists, the USSR sent 2,000 tanks, 700 light and maneuverable aircraft, 7,000 mortars and guns, and more than 100 helicopters and many other weapons to Vietnam. Almost the entire air defense system of the country, flawless and impassable for jet fighters, was built by Soviet specialists with Soviet funds. Military schools and academies of the USSR also trained Vietnamese servicemen. In the skies of North Vietnam, Soviet pilots fought with the American pilots. Of course, the participation of the Soviet pilots in air battles was carried out behind the scenes, since they were sent to the Vietnamese People's Army as instructors and advisors and were officially prohibited from flying combat missions. It was also strictly forbidden to talk in Russian while they were up in the air. By the way, Soviet specialists who served in Vietnam wore exclusively civilian clothing. The USSR provided Vietnam with its newest weapons. About 95 Dvina air defense systems and more than 7,500 missiles were allocated to fight the Americans. The USSR also provided the notorious MiGs, which, according to the Russians, at that time surpassed the American Phantoms in very important factor for combat operations, maneuverability in the horizontal plane. In the period from 1964 to December 31, 1974, the reconnaissance ships of the 38th Brigade of the Special Purpose Ships of the Pacific Fleet were on a permanent basis in the Gulf of Tonkin and carried out combat support for the activities of Soviet air defense units in Vietnam. Here is what upsets the Russians today too. Paradoxically, those countries that yesterday, they say, the USSR helped by word and deed, that is, with finances and human lives of their citizens, to build communism, quickly turned their backs on it. For example, today Vietnam is not at war with America, but a quarter of all Vietnamese exports go straight to the United States. The total volume of trade between Vietnam and the United States exceeds the volume of Vietnam's trade with the Russian Federation by 10 times. When Vietnam needed its own telecommunication satellite, the Vietnamese turned to the United States. The satellite was created by the American firm Lockheed Martin, the one that once made aircraft that bombed Vietnam. And Vietnam paid America $200 million for the first satellite, and later $300 million for the second. Similarly, there are denials of the participation of the GRU in the Vietnam War. The writer historian Elinsky, who worked in Vietnam on the line of military, he was a military journalist. He regularly contacted the leadership of the group of Soviet military specialists in Vietnam, the office of the Soviet military attaché in Hanoi, the intelligence station of the first main directorate of the KGB of the USSR, representatives of the main intelligence directorate of the General Staff of the USSR Armed Forces, and the Ministry of Defense of Vietnam. Based on his own experience, he refutes some of the most obsessive myths about the Vietnam War. 1. Neither the KGB nor the GRU have ever thrown any special groups or special forces detachments into the jungles of South Vietnam to conduct reconnaissance and sabotage activities. 2. Soviet military advisors did not accompany tank columns in the south of Vietnam, Laos, or Cambodia. 3. If military intelligence took part in the operations, it was in the form of intelligence and not military intelligence. That's how he says it. In addition, Soviet military and political intelligence in Indochina met several significant obstacles at once due to the peculiarities of wartime. And then, I guess number 4 would be a regime of movement. The Soviet specialists could not just move around the territory of Vietnam wherever they wanted. Without fail, the Vietnamese side had to be informed about all such movements at least. 6. Difficulties in making direct contacts with the local population since the beginning of the war. None of the GRU units working in Vietnam had a single specialist who knew the Vietnamese language, and the first military translator arrived only in 1967. There were catastrophically not enough translators even to service the activities of the Soviet military intelligence leadership in Vietnam, and about staffing of any units with translators was out of the question. 7. The Vietnamese desire to prevent the Russians and Chinese from clashing on Vietnamese territory. The Vietnamese took into account the Soviet-Chinese tension and reduced any possibility of undesirable encounters between representatives of the two countries that were helping the North Vietnamese. So, the question is, did the GRU that allegedly was not there, according to the debunkers and deniers, know anything about the 1965 incident that did not take place according to the same deniers? I do not know. Maybe somebody else will carry on with this research. Somebody who has access to the archives that are still classified. But I remember this, and I'll repeat. The Soviet diplomat Viktor Zvezdin wrote that Soviet specialists or experts had been working in Vietnam for almost 2 years, since May of 1965, and their activities were coordinated at the level of the ministers of defense of the USSR and the DRV. Contrary to the popular belief that there were only military advisors of the USSR in Vietnam who did not participate in battles, the GRU-DRG carried out operations that could not be entrusted to the intelligence officers of the Socialist Vietnam. That's according to the well-known Russian movie actor Vladimir Zharikov, who had served in the GRU in Vietnam, in the DRG, or this is an abbreviation for Sabotage and Reconnaissance Group, a special purpose unit used for reconnaissance and sabotage in the enemy's rear during the war and pre-war period in order to disorganize rear institutions, destroy or temporarily disable the most important industrial enterprises, military facilities, transport, communications, as well as collect information about the enemy. He was born in 1938. After this high school, Vladimir went to study further and graduated from the Geological Exploration Institute, and he joined the Soviet Army, where he, an excellent athlete, was enlisted in the GRU Special Forces. After passing the intelligence school, Vladimir Zharikov was assigned to be part of the Soviet DRG in Vietnam. Mark Steinberg passed away a few years ago. Russia today is not Russia of the early 1990s. No more open source information is expected to come from there. But in my opinion, the GRU would definitely be interested in the UFO attack on the Soviet troops. And according to the Russian media, in post-war Vietnam, only 2 cases have been recorded that can be attributed to this topic. One, in 2008, an unidentified flying object exploded at an altitude of 8 kilometers above Phu Quoc Island in the Gulf of Thailand, about 15 kilometers from Cambodia's Kampot province. The Vietnamese news agency reported that residents of the island found fragments of gray metal. Vietnamese authorities said that they were unable to identify the object. Soldiers were sent to search for the wreckage and survivors. Local authorities have contacted airlines in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand, but have not received reports of missing aircraft. A deputy commander of the Cambodian Air Force said that he was aware of the crash of a foreign aircraft in Kampot province, but later he retracted his words. In 2013, in Binh Huang province, a flying object exploded in the sky. Shrapnel damaged the roofs of several houses. The hypothesis was as follows: there are remains of a satellite that did not burn up in the atmosphere or the stages of a launch vehicle. It is worth mentioning that there is a military airfield nearby in the neighboring Ninh Thuan province where the airplanes are based. Now I want to tell you quickly my feelings about the Vietnamese people. I knew the both people who escaped this bloody Vietnam socialist regime, communist ideology, and to me they were like brothers and sisters, because I did the same. Only my country was USSR. And I know they made great strides in the countries where they were able to come to it, but many of them perished in the sea. And I hope that someday Vietnam will explore its full potential, and no more wars will be played, and no more foreign actors and all this. But my interest is primarily in ufology and UFO cases, and when Vietnam is a fully free country, I'm sure we might be able to find out more about what took place there during the conflicts in the 1960s and 1970s. For now, it's all classified information. That's how I see it. And if there's anything else that comes out from Russia, I'll let you know, but I don't think anything new will come out anytime soon. Thank you for your attention. Please like my video, subscribe to my channel, and if you can help my research, you'll find the links in the description to this video.